A reading from the book of Genesis. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Take your son," he said, "your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." He replied, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is said, "It will be provided on the Lord's mountain." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command." The word of the Lord.
Please be seated and turn in your scriptures to Genesis chapter 22. We are in a series called God-Saving Deeds, Rescue and Renewal for the Life of the World. These are a series of sermons on the Easter Vigil readings from the Old Testament. Last week you heard from Father Nate Beasley, and I heard it was wonderful from the book of Daniel and God's rescue there. And this week you got me again, so please don't. That was not a play for a clap. All right, God-Saving Deeds. The last academic test I remember taking was the graduate readiness exam, known as the GRE. Anyone here taking the GRE? I was tested on things like vocabulary, math skills, and the ability to write a logical essay. Now, as a grown adult, why would I take a math and vocab test? And the reason is this: because the schools I was applying to needed to know something about me. They needed information. They needed to know what was in my head. Can he write clearly? Okay, can he solve an algebra problem? Does he know the meaning of bamboozled? And that's what academic tests do. They reveal what's in our heads, right? Spiritual tests reveal what's in our hearts. And today's text is about a spiritual test, one of the greatest spiritual tests that anyone has ever taken. Verse 1 of Genesis 22 has a very important phrase, which goes like this: God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham. He would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as an offering to God, an act of worship. Now, from Abraham's perspective, this request would have torn his heart in two different directions. On the one hand, he loves and is devoted to his son, and on the other hand, he loves and is devoted to his God. John Calvin, who commented on this passage, says this, and this is in modern English paraphrase, he says essentially, there comes a point when it makes no sense to obey. And there's no way through, and you're bereft of all good counsel. And in that moment, we pay God the highest honor by surrendering to his plan. Now, that's a perfect description of a spiritual test, and that's exactly what Abraham's facing. Abraham's response to that test would show God what was in his heart. After the test, verse 12, God says, now I know that you fear God. Now, we can just replace Abraham's name for a moment with our own. God tested James. God tested Sandra. God tested Bill. God tested Michelle. How does that reframe what you're facing and what I'm facing? Jill went in for a routine medical checkup. The doctor flagged some concerning symptoms. Further tests reveal that Jill has cancer. They caught it early, but it is spreading. Jill is overcome with anxiety as she waits for answers and for treatment, and just that relief of knowing that she's cancer-free. Antonio is a rising star in his department. He's talented, hardworking, and he's well-regarded by his colleagues. And he's, in fact, on the verge of a huge promotion when the vice president asks him to do an assignment that would compromise his integrity. And he feels torn like Abraham between the conviction of the Holy Spirit and the pull of power. What about Camilla and Elijah? They're 1 year into their marriage, and all their friends are hitting some major financial milestones like buying a house and saving a lot of money and taking nice vacations. Yet Camilla and Elijah feel called to bring children into the world, to be financially generous to missions into their church, and to show hospitality to the neighbors on their block. And this young couple feels torn between security and sacrifice. They're tested. God tested me, and God tested you during that painful breakup, in that tough stage of parenting, through that bout of depression. What's in our heart? We're going to explore 3 questions that are on every spiritual test. Now you know what's on the test. You will know what's on the test. We're going to walk through this story together as we look at each of the questions. The first one is this: will we heed the upward call of God? Will we, in our hour of testing, heed the upward call of God? God tested Abraham by giving him an upward call. Verse 1 of Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am. He answered, take your son. He said, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. Now, at first glance, this doesn't seem to be an upward call at all. First, God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a burnt offering to God. And this is going to present us readers with a significant moral dilemma. What kind of God would demand a human sacrifice, especially a parent, offering up their own child? Isn't this in direct violation of God's commandment not to murder? It seems abhorrent to us. And what's more, Isaac is Abraham's treasure. His son, his only remaining son, the one that he loves with all of his heart. Abraham and Sarah have endured decades of infertility. And Isaac is the promised miracle of God that Abraham's waited for all his years since receiving that promise. And Isaac was born later in life to Sarah when she could no longer bear children. He's a miracle. And Isaac is literally the only future in Abraham's family line. He's the only tangible link between the great nation that God promised would come from Abraham's line, all those stars in the sky, all those bits of sand on the seashore. For God to ask Abraham to offer up Isaac is not just asking him to sacrifice Isaac's life, which is significant enough. He's actually asking Abraham to put to death the very gift of God. He's asking for Abraham to basically surrender everything he has. And this seems very much like a downward call, doesn't it? To go up on the mountain of Moriah meant going down into the valley of anguish. And there's a real mystery here. We can't address every objection and question that this story is going to raise, but I want to focus in on one insight that I don't want us to miss, and that's this. At the end of the day, this call from God was a privilege, and it was upward, because on that mountain, Abraham would experience the living God firsthand in a way that he never had before. And what's more, he would be honored by the living God. Doc Rivers was some of the coach of the Boston Celtics back in their heyday, one of their heydays in 2008 when they won the NBA championship. And Doc Rivers that season told his team something, and he said, look, pressure is a privilege. When the bright lights are on and you're in the playoffs and all the pressure's on and the expectations are high, you've worked really hard to get to that point. Don't wish it away. Don't wish it was any easier. It's a privilege that it's harder. It's a privilege that it's higher. Pressure is a privilege. The upward call of God and the pressure that brings and the anguish that brings, friends, that's a privilege. It's an honor. And the real reward is actually to run toward the pressure and toward the upward call, not away from it. St. Paul once said this, I have suffered the loss of all things so that I may gain Christ and be found in him, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. So let's observe Abraham heed this upward call. Verse 3. So Abraham got up early in the morning, it says. How he must have tossed and turned before getting up that morning. Getting the call, going to bed, not being able to sleep, his soul burdened. And at the first light of dawn, coming out from under his tent, looking up at the sky, the last few stars blinking out as the sun goes up. He can't see the stars anymore. They're there, but he can't see them. Realizing this is the day that I lose my son. He takes next steps. He recruits 2 young men to help them on the journey. And then it's time to retrieve Isaac. He goes over to Isaac. Son, it's time to get up. We need to go on a journey together. At this point, Isaac is a teenager, so he's got to work a little bit harder. Hey, Isaac, hey, buddy. They go over to chop some wood for the fire. And Abraham's surely done this many times before for other sacrifices. But here he is pouring all of his anguish into splitting the wood. And his soul is being split, but he doesn't know what else to do except just chop the next piece of wood. Gathers it up, loads it on the donkey, and off they go onto their journey. Verse 4, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Oh, can you imagine? You're walking, you're journeying, and there it is. There's Mount Moriah. And how his heart must have sank. This is really happening. That's the place where it will happen. That's the place where I lose all the promises. Have you ever had that feeling? Wow, it's really on the calendar. I quit my job in obedience to God's call, and that's the last day on the job. What's after that? I'm still not sure. Or, wow, here I am. We're pulling into the parking lot of the operating room. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to be operated on. I'm going to get new lungs. I don't know if I'm coming out of that operating room or not. Once Jesus' disciples realized, oh, it's an actual cross. It's right there. He's going to be taking it up. He's actually going to be condemned. That's when they ran away. But Abraham saw that place, and he kept going to the upward call of God. Verse 5, then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we will come back to you. By the way, we? Whoever said we would come back to you after we go and worship, we're going to come back? Was Abraham lying? Okay, was he equivocating? Was he hopeful? Was it a prophecy? Maybe it was all of the above. We actually don't know what was in his head when he said we, but we know it was in his heart because he kept walking toward Moriah. He kept taking steps into the upward call of God. Tests reveal the heart. Will we, my friends, heed the upward call of God? Will we take that next right step into the uncertainty of God's call in our life? Instead of running away from it, will pressure be a privilege? Will we sign up for the discipleship course that we know will challenge us at the next level? Will we invite a friend to church and risk rejection? Will we finally make that financial commitment to the missionary whose letter has been sitting on our desks for 3 months? Will we show up to the AA meeting and pour all that liquor down the drain? These, my friends, are the tangible places where we meet the living God, and it's always a privilege. Now, here's a second question for the test that we're facing. Will we trust God's track record? Will we trust his track record? The story begins to slow down, and it becomes a heartbreaking, intimate conversation between father and son. We pick it up in verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand, this is Abraham's hand, he took the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked on together. And as Jesus carried his cross on the way to Golgotha, laboring under the wood, so Isaac carries the wood and walks all the way up to Moriah. And Abraham himself, the father, carrying the implements of death, the fire and the knife. And they walked together for a while in silence up the mountain. And verse 7, then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father? And he replied, here I am, my son. And can you imagine the sadness in Abraham's heart as he responded to Isaac? And then Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? The innocence in Isaac's question and the trust that he has in his father is pretty devastating at this point in the story. It's so innocent and trusting, yet I think there's some innocence too in Abraham's response to Isaac. When he says this, God himself, verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. God will provide. Better translated, interesting word in Hebrew, God will see to it. God will see to the lamb, my son. Now, what in the world is Abraham talking about, by the way? Somehow, in the darkest moment of Abraham's life, with no way out, Abraham had some kind of hope he was drawing on. And I think that he was trusting God's track record. He didn't know how God would do it. He knew God would do it. I think it's important to note that Abraham at this point in his life had been walking with God for a long time. And he'd seen plenty of ups and downs. He'd struggled with God for years. Sometimes he would trust him, and sometimes he would not trust him. God delivered Abraham from a burning city. God fought for him against marauding armies. God rescued Abraham and Sarah from famine, from danger, from powerful kings, and from personal despair. God had a track record with Abraham specifically. And when it came to a point, Abraham chose to trust in that track record, and he paid God the highest honor by doing so. God will see to the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. God will provide. He will take care of it. Was it a prayer? Was it a prophecy? Was it all he had? Yes, yes, and yes. When it comes to the point, will we trust God's track record when we're tested? This sermon series is actually all about God's track record. God's saving deeds, right? Rescue and renewal for the life of the world. God saves, my brothers and sisters. God renews. God sees to it for the life of the world. He actually loves to come through for us in those critical moments where we have no other solution. He loves to make a way where there is no way. And as one of my friends said, that's the thing about resurrections. No one sees it coming. Right? I had a personal experience of this that I've told some of you about. And that is in 2016, I was in a bike accident of no fault but my own, and knocked semi-unconscious, ended up in the ER, and stayed overnight getting good medical care. Thankfully, my helmet protected me. Kids, wear your helmet. And then I was released, and my face looked bad, but thankfully, it healed quickly. And so time passed. I was on my way out the door one Saturday to do a one-to-one Bible study with one of my kids about fear. And on my way out the door, I get the mail, and in the mail is it's a thing from the medical group, and we had medical insurance and everything, and I thought it was great. Open up the bill, $5,000 for the ER stay. That was our responsibility. And I was like, oh, this has got to be a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, but I thought it was a mistake. Medical group side answering the phone. It's Saturday. Thank you for your call. Our agents are available. It was one of those situations. All I could do is go to the Bible study with my son, and it's like we're studying fear, and I'm like, all right, here's an object lesson. I don't know how this is going to get paid. Okay? But I know God will provide. Some people, some kind-hearted saints, took up some funds, as saints do, and helped us cover the bill. And it was amazing. It was so generous. I had also written a letter to the medical group explaining our situation, just basically doing everything we could to make it through. And God provided with the funds of the saints. And it was truly a humbling, heart-touching situation for us. But I remember a few months after that, going to get the mail and getting another piece of mail from the same medical group and opening it up. And it was dated December 24th, Christmas Eve. And dear sir, we've reviewed your situation and we've made an adjustment to the balance that you owe. And the balance you owe is below. And that balance we owed below was $0. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, Proverbs says. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he'll be the one who makes your path straight. He'll make a way, friends. He'll rescue, and when we're tested, we have an opportunity to trust his track record. So look, it's a spiritual test. And you can just be aware that there's going to be the same questions on every one. Will we heed the upward call of God? Will we trust God's track record? Then finally, will we look up to see God's Lamb? Will we look up to see God's Lamb? Abraham and Isaac walk for a long time, side by side. And then they finally come to the place that God had told them about. So Abraham went to work building the altar as he had many times before. But this one must have been harder. He went to work heaving heavy stones with a heavy heart, putting his shoulder into it and his back into it, assembling everything before as unto the Lord. And then Isaac maybe hands him the wood. He takes the wood, from Isaac, and he takes the wood and he puts the wood over the altar so that a sacrifice can be made. And then finally, it's time to bind Isaac. And there's no sign of struggle in this text of Isaac. He's at least a teenager at this point, but we don't hear about him fighting. I believe he knows. He knows what the upward call of God for him is too. And his hands are bound and his feet are bound. Both of them following through to the end, both of them paying God the highest honor. There's no turning back. And Abraham scoops up his son, who represents every promise from God he's ever had in his life, who represents everything that he's left to come to this point, his father's house and his tribe and every adventure he's been through with the living God. He's the last twinkling star in the sky. He's all he's got left. And Abraham will no longer have this promise. He only has the promise giver. And so he places the promise on the altar. And all his trust on God was stayed. And so he would not stay his knife. He raises it in obedience. And as he is about to plunge it into his son's heart, the voice from heaven says, "Abraham!" And we could see this knife dropping from his trembling hands and Abraham crumpling to the ground along with it. "Here I am," Abraham says. And the angel of God says, "Do not harm your son. Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your only son from me." And Abraham looked up and saw the ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it on the altar in the place of his son as a burnt offering. Look up, Abraham, at the substitute. How gratefully Abraham must have been to see that ram whose horns were caught in the thicket, to unbind his son Isaac, to cry tears of relief, and to celebrate with his son. He actually named the place, "The Lord will see to it, the Lord will provide." And you know what a worship service they must have had together, father and son, arm in arm. God's lamb, God's ram, God's substitute on the altar. The smoke rising in praise to God, both of them singing with all of their hearts, praising God for his goodness. Even as God spared Abraham's son from death, he did not spare his only son, the one that he loved, from death. And just as the ram's horns were caught in the thicket, the head of Jesus Christ was covered in thorns. And he went up to the mountain and carried his cross. The perfect Lamb of God was raised up as our salvation, his sacrifice. We look up to him and we see God's provision of the substitute. For all those who have failed their tests, I failed my test, maybe you failed a couple yourself, we look up to see God's substitute, God's Lamb, who did not fail his. We see his mercy, we see his love, we see his readiness to restore us to our call. For everyone who feels abandoned in a horrible situation, we look up to see that God has not abandoned us, but suffers with us and suffers for us. For everyone who isn't sure that they can follow through on the next right step of faith, not sure they can make it, we look up to see God's triumph on the mountain, on Mount Moriah. We see the triumph of his promise. It was not snuffed out in the end. Yes, tests do reveal what's in our hearts. Most of the time, we're going to see something we don't like. Something that needs grace. But tests also reveal something very important we haven't yet talked about, and that is this: tests reveal what's in God's heart. Tests reveal the Lamb. We look up to see the Lamb in our test. As I think about the tests I faced, I think maybe the biggest temptation was to become too inwardly focused and really miss the larger picture. It's actually not about me. It's about what God is doing all around me. And so before the end, there's just one final P.S. I want all of us to see, and it's in the final verse of our reading, verse 18. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my commandment. Think about that, friends. How many billions of people have been impacted by this one act of obedience by Abraham? All the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my commandment. Every single one will be blessed. Think of the ripple effect of Abraham heeding the upward call of God and trusting the track record and taking that next fateful step. The choices that you and I make when we are at the testing point are having an impact way beyond what we can see in the moment. Whether we decide to stay in a difficult marriage and really work on it, when we say no to a romantic relationship that we really do know in our gut is going to pull us away from God and his call on our life, when we choose integrity on the job and refuse to falsify documents, when we find the courage to have that difficult conversation with a parent, we might be the ones going through the test, but they are ultimately not about us. God is going to take this offering obedience, join it to Christ's, and impact everyone around us to the third and fourth generation. What a privilege, friends. God tested Mary, the mother of Jesus. Aren't you glad? She heeded the upward call of God in a moment of incredible vulnerability. God tested the Apostle Peter a few times. Took him a while, but he got it in the end by grace. God tested Polycarp in the flames of martyrdom. Aren't you glad he passed that test? God tested Elizabeth Elliot. God tested Dietrich Bonhoeffer in that German prison. But it wasn't just about them, friends. It was for all of our benefit. My grandfather died when I was in grade school, my father's father. And he left an estate to my father and my uncle, both of them to get his two only sons. But there were other people in the family, in the wider family, that decided to make a claim on part of that inheritance, which I'm understanding this is part of something what happens when an inheritance is given. People come out of the woodwork and start fighting over it, and lawsuits, and it can get very ugly very quickly. And this happened in my father's wider family, people laying a claim on part of this estate. And it had the potential to get very ugly, and my dad actually had a lot of ground to stand on to get his share of the inheritance. And as he and my mother prayed about it, they realized that they were at a testing point, that they had a choice to make. They could fight, and they could win, and they could be a little wealthier. Or they could win a different set of riches, and that is of keeping their witness and showing in a very tangible way at the testing point that money was not as important to them as relationships. And so that's what they chose. And I'm just here to tell you that as someone in the generational line downstream from that choice, I feel much more enriched from that kind of wealth than the other kind of wealth. I'm so glad that my parents, especially my dad, chose to walk away from the funds and walk toward his own Mount Moriah with joy and freedom, and to find the way of the cross to also be a way of life and peace. What test are you facing, my sister, my brother? Are you facing a test? What has the test revealed so far? What do you need from the Lord to take the next right step? Can we look up together this morning, you and me, in the middle of what we're being tested? Can we look up and see God's substitute, God's lamb, and cry out, hallelujah, arm in arm? Let's follow the lamb together up the mountain. to the place of sacrifice where we will pay God the highest honor by trusting Him when we cannot see the way, with confidence that we will see God's saving deeds. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.